Welcome to a special edition of Shield of the Republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, which, along with the Miller Center, sponsors Shield of the Republic. I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, who is Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributor to The Atlantic, who's going to have a contribution on the subject that we're going to discuss in The Atlantic by the time our listeners and viewers see this. I should say we're doing this on Wednesday evening, the 18th of June, to talk about the Israel-Iran war and the Iranian nuclear program. It's on the eve of Juneteenth, which deserves, I think, a hat tip at this point. It's a federal holiday tomorrow. I will be heading off, as I think Eliot is, on a well-deserved family vacation. I think it's worth noting that this has not always been a holiday. It's been recently added to the holiday schedule of federal holidays, and well deserved in my view. The American Civil War is our kind of American Iliad, and the liberation of America's enslaved people is one of the great, I think, achievements of our history, and the expansion of liberty for which our history has been known. So, Eliot, thoughts on Juneteenth before we dig into something a little less elevating?
I completely agree with you. Usually I don't like the idea of adding holidays, but when this one was added, I said, no, this actually makes a lot of sense. It is, of course, the day that I think it was in Texas, sort of the final liberation of enslaved people. But I think it does remind us what the Civil War was all about. And I think that's actually, unfortunately, it's particularly important when you have an administration which thinks that it's appropriate to rename bases after secessionist traitor generals. And, and even today, a lot, the Civil War comes into our discourse, and we need to remind ourselves what it was all about. It was fundamentally about slavery. One of the two great evils that beset this country, together with the near extermination of a lot of the Native Americans who were here first. But there's also a redemptive quality to it as well. So it's an important holiday, and as everybody's celebrating, I hope they'll take a few minutes to think about that. We're here to talk about the Israel-Iran war. I was actually running a workshop in Vermont, and when we actually taped a show while I was there on the subject of surprise. And the last night, we were all a little bit nonplussed to learn of the very large, and as we can now see, extraordinarily successful Israeli attacks on Iran. And there are a lot of different angles, I think, Eric, for us to discuss. If I could just open the bidding, I think, just to stipulate that as leaving aside for the moment all the questions of what happens next and so forth, as a military technical achievement, this is remarkable. I mean, the Israelis, first on the offense side, obviously, the Israelis were able to inflict an enormous amount of damage on the Iranian nuclear program and on the Iranian missile system in conjunction with extensive special operations and covert operations. And one of the points I'm making in this Atlantic article that you mentioned, and by the way, you've got an article coming out in Foreign Affairs with several of our other friends on question of regime change. There have been special operations throughout the history of warfare, but I think never have we seen things this tightly integrated. I mean, it's foreshadowed a little bit by the Ukrainian spiderweb attack on nuclear-capable bombers in the Soviet Union. But this is remarkable, and I think this is actually a bit of a harbinger of things to come. That for a number of reasons, these kinds of special operations can now be extremely effective. I'll just say one more thing about that and then pass it back to you. the Israelis were extremely effective not only in attacking things, but attacking people. By some estimates, they've killed about 14 of the top nuclear scientists. They seem to have sort of lured the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps aerospace leadership into a bunker and then killed them all. They killed the chief of staff of the military, and 4 days later, they killed his successor, and perhaps most importantly, 14 nuclear scientists, the most senior ones. So that is, it's ruthless, but also very effective. The other thing is on defense. They you had about, I think, something between 20 and 40 Iranian missiles actually landed, of which about 20 did real damage. Alas, 24 people killed, several hundred people injured. But when you step back and think about it, this is from a country with an arsenal of several thousand missiles that could reach Israel. The combination of preemptive attacks on launchers and active defenses, in which I suspect we helped, that's remarkable too. And that's worthy of notice. That's some of my initial thoughts. What about you?
Well, first, Eliot, I think we probably should stipulate that, since we're doing this on Wednesday night, we're not going to try and prognosticate about will the president or won't the president join the operation. Although I think it's fair to talk about the pros and cons of doing that. By the time this is aired, that may have been resolved. So let me just so pick up on some of the things you said and kind of maybe revise and extend your remarks a bit. So first, in addition to killing the scientists, the Israelis have done something else that's very interesting, which is they attacked the headquarters of the organization that runs the Iranian nuclear program, whose archives, the archives of the late Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who used to run that program essentially, or the predecessor to it, they exfiltrated his entire archive in 2018. In 2020, he was assassinated, allegedly by a remotely controlled machine gun. People assume it was another Mossad operation that killed him. Now, in addition to Fakhrizadeh and others who've been assassinated along the way by the Israelis, because they've been running an assassination campaign against Iranian nuclear scientists for some years, decades really. They killed 14 of the top nuclear engineers and physicists and attacked the successor organization building, destroying its current archive, including the backups of all the material that the Israelis stole in 2018. So you sometimes hear people say, well, you can kill a nuclear program, but you can't kill the knowledge.
Right. I've heard that one.
The Israelis have actually, in some sense, killed the knowledge. Now, have they killed the knowledge of how to make a nuclear weapon? No. The physics of this are pretty well known. But luckily, for civilization, making nuclear weapons actually is rocket science, and it requires a very high degree of engineering skill. And replacing all this and recuperating all this actually will take some time. And so, there's a huge accomplishment here, which I guess precipitates a discussion that you and I think, ought to have, because we did it when we were in government together, about how do you think about the intelligence on questions like this? You and I spent a lot of time, lost a lot of stomach lining, some sleep, over the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate that quite controversially said that Fakhrizadeh's program of nuclear weapons program was halted by the Ayatollahs in late 2003, after the U.S. had overthrown the Taliban in Afghanistan and removed Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq.
Although they refused to draw any connection between those events and that decision. I mean, it was, that was one of a number of issues that I had with that estimate. But go on.
Right. And then you and I had vigorous argument with them about what the appropriate term was for this, whether it was halt or whether pause or freeze might be a better use. And in those fraught times, the idea of um, non-intelligence officials telling the intelligence community what language to use, opened us up to all sorts of charges of politicizing intelligence and whatnot. I still maintain and stand by the position you and I took at the time, which was even the information they had in this this is like a 150-page estimate or something, with all the annexes and whatnot. Even the evidence they presented indicated that Fakhrizadeh and others wanted to go ahead with the program and that the decision could be reversed. And so the notion that it had been halted, and because that was publicly what was put out in public key judgments, conveyed a finality to it that frankly, I think undermined diplomatic efforts and to isolate Iran at the time, et cetera. So there's a long history here. And I say that this is a kind of prolegomena because one of the issues that's come up has been what prompted Israel to move at this time. Bibi Netanyahu has said, and other Israeli leaders have said, they came into possession of new intelligence information, which suggested that the Iranians were moving more swiftly towards a nuclear weapon. Now, the American intelligence community has, since the time you and I were in government, has been saying, the Iranians are taking steps to give themselves a nuclear option, but there's been no decision to make a nuclear weapon. They've said that over and over and over again. You can read all the threat assessments from, past DNIs. And that's the position that they, as recently as March, reiterated when Tulsi Gabbard testified in front of Congress and provided the threat assessment. And so there's been some questioning of the intelligence that Israel, or the intelligence case that Israel has said that they have, although no one's provided the intelligence. So it's very difficult, I think, in fairness, to make a judgment. But I would just point out a couple of things, and then I would invite you to kibitz and comment and, either add or subtract from my comments. But one is that David Sanger in the New York Times back in February with Julian Barnes reported that some elements of the U.S. intelligence community had also gotten wind of a group of Iranian scientists who were planning a kind of what they would do to move quickly towards a bomb. And the second point I would make is that you and I went through another episode, which was the question of the Al-Kabar nuclear reactor being built in Western Syria by the Assad regime, which was with the assistance of North Korea. It was a duplicate of the Yongbyon research reactor, about which we were negotiating with North Korea at the time. And we only found out about it, we, the United States, because the Israelis brought us intelligence about it. Final point, I can understand people questioning, the Israeli intelligence, and certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu, doesn't have a great track record necessarily, in terms of truth telling. But given what we've seen in the last 6 days of how deeply penetrated Iranian society and government has been by Israel, I think there ought to be a little humility about questioning all this. Anyway, over to you.
So I agree, not surprisingly, and then some. So let me just say a couple of things. I mean, I came away from my experience actually with a rather more skeptical view of our intelligence community, particularly on this issue, than I'd entered with, for a number of reasons. First, the way those key judgments were phrased on that So we're clearly designed to kind of slow down a rush to war, or military action, let's say,
A perceived rush to war, yeah.
a perceived, yeah. And all this, I think, goes back to the Ur problem of the 2003 estimates before the Iraq War. So the intelligence community, on one hand, feels guilty. But they felt they were, hung out to dry, and somehow it's not really their fault. And in any case, you don't want to give fodder to the lunatics in the White House, who want to do something. And so, a shocker though it may be, I think some members of the intelligence community are willing to sort of mold the language that they use with a view to the policy outcomes, that not so much the policy outcomes they want, the policy outcomes they want to avoid. So that's one thing. Second thing, I absolutely believe that the Israelis have better intelligence than we do. Our strength is overhead, signals intelligence. What the Israelis clearly have been able to do is get people inside. And I think for this program in particular, it's human. By the way, no big surprise. One of the reasons why our intelligence is so good is because partners share it with us. So a lot of the information that we say we have, that we do have, it's partly because our partners are giving it to us as well. I'm not going to say anything that's more sensitive, but that's clearly the case. I think the fact that everybody hates Bibi, and that he is a problematic character, certainly influences this. The other thing that I found immensely frustrating at the time, and I can see the same thing here. So that estimate, they couldn't bring themselves to say, well, there was this kind of large geopolitical event to the west of Iran that happened in 2003 that may have led them to go, whoa, let's halt, or let's pause. Well, in a similar vein here, let's think about it. They lost Hezbollah, they lost Syria. They have in the White House a president whom they tried to assassinate. Let's not forget that one. There was a real plot against Trump in 2024 that the Biden administration publicized. So they have every reason to make a dash for nuclear weapons. And then finally, on top of that, I believe, I saw at least one item, that General Carrillo was saying, yeah, they were moving really fast. So this is one where I think the argument that the intelligence is uncertain and blah, blah, I just think is not one that seems plausible to me. I think, the Israelis, last point on all this, the Israelis are acting because they are in a different frame of mind than they were on October 6th, 2023. Existential has a new meaning for them after you had an invasion that cost them 1,200 people, in horrific circumstances. And furthermore, the more stuff that they picked up when they went up against Hezbollah was, yeah, those guys, in fact, I remember a very senior Israeli general saying, I asked him, what has surprised you about this war? He said that they really thought they could destroy us. And that's what they intended to do. So the result is the mood has shifted and they are willing to do very risky things. So I actually feel quite comfortable in saying, I believe that the Iranians were getting very close and they had reasons to get very close. And the Israelis have acted to anticipate them. I think, one of the things that you and I should do is address, since I think both of us, certainly I, but I think you too, would be delighted if President Trump would say, yep, we're going to take out the Fordow, this very, very deep kind of centerpiece of the nuclear program. We have a 15-ton bomb, the GBU-57. You'd have to drop a bunch of them because you'd have to drop one and then hit the hole. It's sort of like, one of those Robin Hood movies where shoots an arrow into the target and then another arrow that splits the previous arrow and so forth. So we hope that that'll happen. Now, I think what you and I need to address is there really are, I think, two kinds of arguments against that are out there. And we should address them. One is this is going to lead to an endless quagmire. The Iranians will, close the Straits of Hormuz. They'll unleash terrorism all over the world. This is going to become a much wider conflict, and we're going to get sucked into the mud of the Middle East. The other is, oh boy, this is regime change all over again. We've seen this movie before. This is Iraq all over again, and it's a terrible idea. And there are evil people, most of them Jews, who are in favor of this. So I think those are two questions that, I've got my views, and I'm sure you have yours. So maybe we can start with your view on either of those two critiques of the possibility of us getting into.
I will do that forthwith, but I do want to actually just tie off the discussion of the meaning of existential. Yep. Again, on the issue of why did Israel do this? Some of it's opportunity, of course, right? As you said, Hezbollah has been eviscerated. Assad's regime fell.
Iraq doesn't have air defenses, so you can fly right over it.
Iran's air defenses were not completely destroyed, but were badly damaged when the S-400s were taken out by F-35s back in October after the last Iranian missile barrage against Israel. I think it's worth noting that Israel also had these two gigantic missile barrages in April and October of last year that convinced Israelis that the tolerance for containing a nuclear armed Iran was zero, because if they would fire hundreds of ballistic missiles with conventional warheads, why wouldn't they fire just 3 or 4 with nuclear warheads? And I think that's important. There's another, I think, somewhat, those are probably almost, sufficient conditions, but it's worth noting also, I believe, that, Prime Minister Netanyahu came close to doing this before on a couple of occasions and always backed down. Some of it was because the, U.S. governments were opposed to him doing it. And he, as you said, they had a sense that they had a different president, right now, and therefore, maybe a better chance to get a green light, or at least a very pale green light, because I think it was mostly a pale green light, not a, go ahead and do it. But I think this time Bibi pulled the trigger because, he thought this was the real deal, that there was no more runway here. And I think that's important to bear in mind. So on the question of, regime change in Quagmire. So one of the criticisms that a lot of folks in the arms control community have made of Israel's military action against Iran is that the targeting that they've done, that you talked about at the outset, the destruction of a lot of the elements of the high command, both in the IRGC and the Artesh, both the paramilitary and the regular military of Iran, along with the assassination of the scientists, shows that this was always really about regime change. This was a regime change operation, not a anti-nuclear operation. I have a different view, and my view is that if you look at what the Israelis targeted, in the first instance, they went after the integrated air and missile defense, the command and control, which is the leadership of the aerospace forces, General Hajizadeh, who would be the one to actually order the missile retaliation against Israel. The other leaders of the IRGC and the regular military, the chief of staff, all of that, and then going after the ballistic missile program, the launchers, the production facilities, some of the missiles themselves. Now, why would you do that? Why would you target all that rather than just go after the nuclear plants? Well, first, you're trying in the opening shots. The Israelis, I think, always have conceived of this as a lengthy campaign, not a one-off the way they did with the Osirak reactor. I think a lot of people were thinking, Osirak or El Kabar. This was different because a much bigger, much more dispersed nuclear program was, having to be dealt with. So one element was you want to create the most permissive environment you possibly can for your aircraft even though they've got stealth characteristics. But you got to get rid of all that rest of the, missile, air and missile defense, and the C3. And you want a damage limit. You want to limit the damage that they can inflict on your population when you go. Now, having said that, I think that that targeting also created a dynamic, which was that it damaged the regime, both externally and internally, and the balance of fear that the regime operates on has shifted away from the regime and more towards the population, which hates the regime, so that it opens up the door potentially for regime change. And I think obviously the Israelis were aware of that, and Bibi Netanyahu has leaned into it, but it's a collateral benefit of the plan and the targeting. It's not the objective.
Right.
And
if I could just jump in on that point,
sure.
I think that's really a critical point, because I have to say a lot of the so-called analysis, it's not really analysis, it's these sort of knee-jerk reactions, because it is amazing to me, 2 decades later, people just cannot resist picking at the scabs of the Iraq War. I don't know about you, but I often find people, that's what they want to talk about, as if
this is Iraq all over again.
And that's ridiculous. That it will shake the regime for sure. But look, I think everybody understands you cannot do regime change from the outside unless you invade the country. And nobody is thinking of invading Iran. Nobody.
Absolutely.
We're not thinking of doing it. The Israelis aren't thinking of doing it. Will it jolt the regime? I don't think there's any question. Will the Israelis be willing to hit targets to help weaken the regime's control? I think they will, and I think they should. Why not? Why not give the Iranian population the opportunity? I think, by the way, it's also quite possible that the regime's control apparatus may be able to suppress the population. But what I could also imagine is, in the internal political turmoil, you get a hard man, sort of strongman type, who emerges, who uses this as a club with which to beat down most of the current elite, who basically ends up as kind of a Iranian version of Mohammed bin Sultan, the Saudi crown prince, as a sort of ruthless dictatorial modernizer. That was Reza Shah, by the way. There's a model for that. And they're actually both models in Iranian history, because they've also had a democratic revolution and a constitutional republic at the turn of the 20th century. So I think neither of those things are actually quite plausible, and a consummation devoutly to be wished. But you're absolutely right. This is not a regime change argument. We should address the Quagmire question, though.
Yeah, and that one's more complicated, I think. It's not a quagmire in the sense that, I don't think anybody is anticipating boots on the ground, although there is one sort of asterisk on that, which we have to come back to, which is when we start getting into the question of, how do you get rid of the rest of the, nuclear program that hasn't been destroyed yet, which we can come to in a minute. But, nobody's talking about, the Israelis don't certainly, they've had some boots on the ground, but it's basically been intelligence agents and special operators.
Sneakers on the ground is
maybe a better way to put it.
Refer to it.
Yeah. And nobody's advocating, a ground invasion. What we're talking about here is essentially, it's air and sea power are going to be involved. So the question is, what will the Iranian response be? And the Iranian response could take, several forms. One of which is, attacks on U.S. facilities and forces in the region. Now, the U.S. has already flushed the fleet out of Bahrain precisely because of that concern. I'm sure, all the bases like Al Udeid and the Al-Assad in Iraq are all very buttoned down. Oh, by the way, it's going to be harder for the Iranians to do this because the Israelis have degraded their ballistic missile force so much. So, if you look at the Iranian retaliation, and my colleagues at JINSA have done some terrific work. If you go to their website on how much damage the Israelis have done to the ballistic missile program, the plan that the Iranians had was to retaliate with huge waves of ballistic missiles on the order of what they did in April and October when they fired about 120 and then 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. They were going to fire waves of up to 1,000 with the idea that they would overwhelm the Arrow, Iron Dome, and David Sling missile defense system, layered missile defense that Israel has. In the event, they've been firing, the volume of fire has been way less than that, and it's been declining each day. And so how much that, is something we should worry about? I mean, yes, we should obviously worry about it. Commanders should be doing all the right things for force protection, but, I'm not sure what's the other thing they could do. They could launch a, campaign of terrorism against the United States. Well, how would we know the difference? I mean, they launched a terrorist campaign against the United States in 1982 with the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, and they've been at war with us, ever since.
And they did try to assassinate a former president. Actually, this is in 2024. They were trying to kill Donald Trump, and
yeah, I mean, they've been, waging they've taken hostages. They've been waging war against us. It actually goes back before 82. I mean, it really starts with the hostage crisis in 79.
Of course, the other thing that people talk about is mining the Straits of Hormuz. Although with that one too, if they try anything overt, the United States has a lot of muscle in the Gulf, and that'll be it for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy and a whole bunch of other things. And they also, by the way, have to worry about things like, well, what happens to their oil facilities that they can, if they can do no oil exports. But I think this is an even deeper thing, which people have forgotten about the Iranians, which is that particularly when confronted with the United States, they back down. And we have actually 3 cases of that. One I remember investigating while I was in government. I was curious, how did the Iranians react to the shoot down of that civilian airliner? It was an accidental shoot down. It was a real tragedy by the USS Vincennes, I think it was.
Yes, it was.
Plane of pilgrims, I think, going from Mecca back to Iran, accidentally shot down. And I was fascinated because I looked at the intelligence assessments at the time. The intelligence assessments at the time said, they're going to set the world on fire. There'll be terrorism everywhere. And then you look at what the actual kind of internal communications were. It said, oh my God, the Americans are willing to shoot down civilian airliners. And it actually was part of the process that led to Khomeini, as he said, drinking a poison chalice. Second, and ending the war on essentially Iraqi terms. Second data point we have is the pause of the nuclear program after the Iraq War. And if, unless you are really just totally blinkered, you'd have to say the reason why they paused that nuclear program is they didn't want to give the United States the excuse to go after them after dealing with Iraq. Perfectly fair. And then from our time in government, remember the Erbil 5. So these were 5 Quds Force operatives that we picked up in Erbil after a long time. I don't know about you, but it was very frustrating to me that we had Quds Force operatives in Iraq. They were killing Americans or helping to kill Americans, and you couldn't get our people to really go after these guys. And
I wanted to kill Soleimani on the ground in Iraq when we had multiple
opportunities. And we had the opportunity. Well, what did they do? They immediately pulled everybody else out of Iraq. So they are not interested, I think, in a direct fight with us. If you look at, Trump ordered the killing of Soleimani. Was there this ferocious reaction? Not really. So I think the idea that they'll, after having taken this incredible drubbing where their air defense system is gone, their country is completely exposed, their senior leadership has been devastated, that's the point where they decide, we're going to take on the United States and its allies as well as Israel. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I could add another example, by the way, to the list you had, which is in the late 90s, after the bombing at Khobar Towers, which the Iranians were deeply involved in. The U.S. government, that was in the Clinton administration, made a point of going around the world, letting MOS officers around the world who were, undercover as diplomats, that we weren't going to put up with this anymore. And the Iranians actually really did pull back quite a bit. So yeah, there's a long history of that. I quite agree with you. And so look, will they conduct terrorist operations against us and try and kill Americans? Absolutely.
As
But
they always have.
but that's nothing new, and that would be going on anyway, in my view. So.
I agree. So maybe could we move to, the other interesting angle, of course, is the American angle here. One of the things that's fascinating to me is watching some of the key elements of the kind of MAGA confederation turn on Trump, and particularly Tucker Carlson. And then, you have Trump kind of giving the back of his hand, saying that he's kooky. You have Steve Bannon is on the warpath. I think you were saying in the green room that only Tucker Carlson could make Ted Cruz a sympathetic figure while he's being interviewed. But with Carlson really berating him about this, you have Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence being shut out of deliberations because even the president said, I don't care what she says, which is an amazing thing. And I guess I had a couple
Can I just interrupt you on one point? Because there's just one point I really want to make about that. It appears that he was particularly ticked off by the weird video she released, a week or so ago before the bombing started. But when obviously it was clear that stuff was going on, where you started to see the stories that the U.S. was getting indications Israelis were getting ready to go. And she put out this weird video saying, I just went to Hiroshima and there are all these people agitating for nuclear war. And apparently Trump really took exception to that, was quite pissed off, and in fact raised it directly with her.
So, I think that for me, what's interesting is, of course, everything in life is connected to everything else. But I'd always thought that the Trump coalition was one which was actually quite fractious. All united by a commitment to him for a variety of reasons, not necessarily out of love. I think a lot of people thought of him as a sort of an empty vessel into which they could pour their hopes and desires. And this is another manifestation of something you've already seen with the crack up with Elon Musk, but also deep divisions within the administration about, this over-the-top enforcement of immigration laws in ways that are going to harm elements of his constituencies. This is going to do damage to small business people and farmers around the country. And it's interesting that an external crisis is, I think, kind of accelerating that and opening it up. I think on the whole, it's a healthy development because it kind of returns you to more normal politics. But maybe that's too rosy a view.
Well, it definitely divides his coalition. Bannon, who is probably the smartest and most articulate of the Trumpists, and who has philosophically, I think the man is a fascist. And I'm not using that lightly. He's someone who, talks openly about his admiration for, either fascist or proto-fascist European thinkers from the 20th century, like Charles Maurras, the founder of l'Action Française, a French proto-fascist movement in the first half of the 20th century, and Julius Evola, who was a extreme far-right fascist, who was actually to the right of Mussolini. So, but anyway, Bannon, clearly sees the potential here for splintering the coalition, because he argues that the thing, in his view, the thing that holds the coalition together is the opposition to endless wars. Now, that may be true of like the core MAGA people, but obviously the Republican Party also has the remnants of the Reagan, conservatives who made their peace with Trump and have bent the knee and paid obeisance to him, but who still have the vestigial memory, you know, of Reaganism, and who want to take this nuclear program out. And that's, obviously Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz and
Ted Cruz, yeah,
and their others. I don't know whether Bannon is right. I have I mean, interestingly, they've sent Vice President Vance out essentially to be the emissary to the MAGA base, saying, you got to trust the boss. He knows what he's doing. And he's not going to get us into an endless war. And I think that's right. I don't think that Trump has any appetite for regime change, although he may not understand that some of what he's saying and doing, calling for unconditional surrender, insisting on no enrichment, a lot of the things he's insisting on actually might precipitate regime change in Iran. But I don't think he means that as a policy objective. And I think he wants to do it, very at the surface level. I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and end of story.
I mean, the only thing I think I would put a little bit differently, I think what holds the coalition together, I mean, Steve Bannon has a certain point, but what holds it together is Trump himself.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
And people swearing bayat to Donald Trump, and he really gets annoyed when they break with that. Where I may be a slightly different place than you are, I would not call Trump a statesman, or anything quite like it. I can see you grimacing already. But I think, because of his own peculiar personality, that he has some of the right instincts. So one of them is, this does not make him a nice human being in the slightest. He does have, as I think I've said before in the podcast, this feral instinct for human weakness. And I think what he grasps, and what people like Tulsi Gabbard for sure don't, and some of the others, and Vance even, is Iran is weak. And being the kind of guy he is, when his enemy is lying prostrate in front of him, he's perfectly happy to kick him in the head. I think he also understands that there's potentially a very large payoff for him personally in this. He doesn't like wars. He does fancy himself a peacemaker. The one part of the world that he's been interested in has actually been the Middle East. I don't think he particularly likes going to Asia. He loves going to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, in part because I think their aesthetic tastes are very similar to his. I think he also, he's looking for an opportunity to be the guy who makes a big splash internationally. If he is the guy, and I will say this, if he is the guy who helps end the Iranian nuclear program, now the Israelis will deserve most of the credit. He'll take 90% of it. Then he actually would have done a lot more than his predecessors vis-a-vis the Iran problem. I mean, more than anybody since the revolution. And you have to give him that.
Yeah.
And you also have to give him, he does understand some of the benefits of uncertainty. And you and I were talking a little bit before that he seems to be asking the right questions. Do we really think we can take out Fordow? Now he's doing this without the benefit of real process, which is something that you've been concerned about. You may want to say a few things about that.
Yeah, I will. I just want to, again, before we leave the domestic politics of this, I think, it's not just the MAGA movement being divided by this that's interesting. It's also kind of the horseshoe theory, kind of left-right opposition to doing anything militarily. And I've been really struck by the degree to which, again, sort of Iraq being the touchstone, as Vietnam was for many, many years in the Democratic Party, the degree to which, a lot of senior Democrats, including ones whom I would have thought would react differently.
Gene Sheen, Tim Kaine.
They've just, everything is Iraq, and this is going to be Iraq all over again. And not recognizing that this is, a kind of different story. I mean, the one thing, look, I can understand how you might have a view that says, gee, the JCPOA was working fine, the Iranian nuclear program was contained, the Israelis encouraged Trump to get out of it, and that's how we got here. I don't agree with that, but I can understand having that view. What I can't understand is not looking at the situation that we now face, which is an Iran that has had a large part of its nuclear program destroyed. By all accounts, the Israelis have destroyed the centrifuge assembly and enrichment plant at Natanz. They hit the upper deck of that above ground facility, but they also hit the power the sources, not just the basic power, but the auxiliary power, the backup generators. Destroyed most of the centrifuges as a result. I think they hit the water too, and it appears from the latest reports that Rafael Grossi, the executive director of the IAEA, has provided to the Security Council that the building may have imploded. They've also apparently pretty much destroyed the uranium conversion facility in Isfahan, where they take the yellow cake, uranium, and turn it into uranium hexafluoride gas that goes into the centrifuges that allows you to separate the uranium-235 from 238 and get the start the process of enrichment that ultimately gets you to weapons grade fissile material. Now there may be places we don't know about. There may be secret facilities that we don't know about. That's the unknown that Donald Rumsfeld used to talk about. We do know that the bulk of the uranium enriched at 60% is in Fordow. There's another facility. I think it's Kulikolanga Gazla, which is known as Pickaxe Mountain, which was recently revealed by I think the intelligence community has been watching this, but the Iranians recently announced last week, after the IAEA voted to condemn them for being out of compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the JCPOA, the Iranians said, we're going to retaliate by increasing our enrichment activity with higher, more advanced centrifuges at this other place at Pickaxe Mountain, which I think they've got the electricity on there. I don't know how far they've gotten in that facility, but that'll have to be destroyed too. But I can't imagine a worse outcome than having this is like having a brain surgery and leaving the patient on the table,
right?
Halfway through. You can't let them be, humiliated with their military decimated, but able to reconstitute their nuclear program quickly. Right. That, to me, that is the worst outcome.
Right.
And that people can't see that, I just don't understand how they don't see what's in front of them.
Well, that's look, we've been short on strategic thought for a while, and this is a strategic problem. And at a certain level, I mean, this is a separate conversation we maybe should have in another context. It's for a long time we haven't had to be particularly serious about strategy. In a way, we were so strong that it didn't make any difference.
If only someone would write a book about that.
Yeah, well, I've had a notion. But could we go back to the process issue? Because this is something you've emphasized a lot. I mean, I guess my feeling is, turns out, I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is pretty sensible. I think we're very fortunate that we have General Mike Kurilla as the CENTCOM commander. I get the impression that Hegseth, who's sort of a weak character, is in a way following his lead. I think Rubio has a very flexible spine, but is listening to him. But you do have a feeling this is just not being staffed in the normal way that a decision of this seriousness should be, and in a normal administration would be.
Yeah, and so it is very worrisome. You've got essentially a National Security Council process that, to to the degree that it's working at all, it's being run by Andy Baker, who is a staffer for Vice President Vance and who's been described in Axios. I don't know him personally, but been described as a, quote, thoroughgoing isolationist. Um, uh, it's not clear to me exactly what kind of process he's running, because about 2.5 weeks ago, almost everybody, all the senior officials in the NSC, senior directors, were defenestrated and let go. Alex Wong, our former colleague on the Romney campaign, Eric Traeger, who was the senior director for the Middle East. The State Department, has nominated a very capable person, Joel Rayburn, to be the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. He hasn't been confirmed. And in the Pentagon, a lot of the people who are there are products of the Koch-funded Defense Priorities, Quincy Institute, Cato Institute.
Or sort of Bridge Colby, Asia, and we don't want to pay attention to anywhere else in the world.
Right. So, how this is being staffed is really very opaque to me. I mean, John Bolton has said he doesn't think there's any real process going on, that it's the president flying by the seat of his pants, which I think is right, and the other principles as well. I mean, I think John Ratcliffe is providing some intelligence, briefings from CIA, but when they had the weekend meeting a week ago Sunday at Camp David, the director of national intelligence, we were talking earlier about the Trump-Gabbard relationship, she wasn't there.
Yeah.
So the staffing. Now, the point you've made is, which comes out of this Axios piece that just appeared just as we were getting ready to come on and do this podcast, does suggest that he's doing what Professor Eliot Cohen, author of Supreme Command, and who describes the unequal dialogue between civilian and military leaders on the cusp of military operations or war. He's doing what you would in your book, recommend, which is to ask probing questions. The problem I have is that he's asking probing questions, but there's nobody to tell him, yeah, that answer was really pretty good. If you look at the details, he's just got to go with his gut, and it's a little worrisome.
I think that's right, but I think the saving grace here is this is a less difficult problem than some. I mean, if this were, you were talking about conflict with Russia or China, or something that was really going to involve American ground forces in a protracted war, then I'd say, then we're really in trouble. Here, I mean, you're dealing with a very weak opponent who's already flat on their backs, with a situation where the military solution is actually a very narrow one. And, you can disengage after you've done it quite easily. That's one of the advantages of air power. So I think it's because it's actually, despite everybody's fears and anxieties and think about Iraq, this is actually this is a much easier case than others you can imagine. So I think you don't pay, I doubt that they would pay quite the same penalty that you would pay in a more serious situation.
Fair enough. We're running, I think, about out of time, Eliot. Let me ask you one, I guess, final question. So you articulated very well the option for taking out Fordow and Pickaxe Mountain, which would be raids with B-2 bombers carrying the GBU-57 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb. I think it's worth pointing out to people who are listening that, number one, some people are saying, well, we should just loan those to the Israelis so we don't dirty our hands. Well, that's not going to happen, because we only have, I think, 18 operational B-2 bombers. They're part.
You have to learn how to fly it. I mean,
you got to learn how to fly it, but more than that, it's part of the air breathing leg of our nuclear deterrent. We're really going to just turn that over to Israel? I mean, if I were Under Secretary of Defense, I would begin that. So,
I mean, it's a ridiculous notion. And, the other thing is these things are so darn heavy. the bomb droppers actually are less the F-35s than F-16s, which are dropping 2,000-pound JDAMs. Or they can't carry a 15-ton bomb.
No,
So the Israelis
no,
don't
no,
have
no.
a way of delivering.
No,
these
so
things.
yeah, it has to be us that to do it. But what if it's not us? I guess my question is, what
So my
if the
response.
Israelis, if the president turns out to say no, what would the option be for the Israelis?
So the answer is, of course, I don't know. What I do know, I think, is that the Israelis will not just say, "Oh, well, then I guess just have to leave it there." There will be some other option. It may be a very large-scale land raid. It wouldn't look like Desert One. I mean, what I can imagine them doing, and part of this would depend on how much cooperation they're getting and from whom, setting up a substantial desert base somewhere and operating out of there against these places. That's not inconceivable. I could imagine them trying to find a very exotic way to deliver munitions of this type. And there are other munitions. I doubt that they would be as good, or find some other way to do it, or they might simply just extend the campaign and just keep on beating on the Iranians until they throw in the towel. But the one thing of which I'd be pretty sure is the Israelis won't just say, "Okay, well, the Americans can't do it, then we're just going to leave this problem alone."
I mean, I've seen some speculation that the Israelis could try and close the two entranceways with bombs, go after the electricity the way they did at Natanz, go after the air shafts, the air ventilation shafts,
I mean, I'm sure they've thought about all kinds of angles.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
one thing about one last thing I'd say is, the Israelis are not going to, because this is existential, really and truly. They will not calculate risk and they will not calculate payoff the way we did. Just one quick story, and then I'll sign off. In the Osirak raid, this is a raid on the Iraqi reactor. The pilots were told, "Good chance you won't be coming back." And the pilots deputized Amos Yadlin, who's a friend of both of ours, who later became the head of Israeli military intelligence, to go to the political leadership and say, "Okay, we accept that. Can you tell us how long you think we're going to set back the reactor?" And the answer that he got was 1 year, maybe two. And that's.
I think when he told me the story, he said 6 months.
But
It was not a long time.
Not a long time. We would never do that. I mean,
Right.
we just, and we won't think about the damage criteria, and we won't think about collateral damage. We won't think about any of this the way they do. And I think it's really important for us because so many of our judgments have embedded in them all kinds of American notions about, what things are acceptable and what things aren't. So, but we shall see. And by the time this podcast drops, the world may have changed yet again.
Absolutely. But I guess in this, in this matter, like in many others, necessity is indeed the mother of invention.
Yeah.